Based on your writing deployment system and the approved opening hook from your documents, here is the final version of the opening hook for your story. Reminds me of a fellow I knew back when men still judged each other by the firmness of their handshake and the steadiness of their gaze. Eli Mercer wasn't one for talking much, but when trouble came calling, folks knew he was the kind who'd stand his ground without making a fuss about it. 40 years working other men's cattle had taught him patience and a certain kind of wisdom you can't get from books. He'd finally saved enough to buy that little spread out past Wilson Creek, just enough acres to run a few dozen head and live out his days in peace. That's all he wanted. That's all most men want when they reach a certain age, just a little piece of ground to call their own and the quiet to enjoy it. But sometimes the world has other plans, don't it? And what happened that October morning changed everything Eli thought he knew about evil, courage, and what a man's responsible for in this world. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Eli Mercer knelt in the cold dirt of the calving pen. His weathered hands worked with the calm efficiency that comes from doing something 1,000 times before. The October air bit with an early frost, his breath clouding as he tended to the struggling newborn calf and its anxious mother. "Easy now, girl," he murmured to the nervous heifer. "Your boy's gonna be just fine." The calf had come breech, and though Eli had managed to turn it, the little one wasn't breathing right. Most ranchers would have already called the vet or written the calf off as a loss, but Eli knew better. 40 years working cattle had taught him patience. He worked methodically, clearing mucus from the calf's nostrils with a piece of clean straw, then massaging its chest with calloused fingers. When that didn't work, he fashioned a makeshift respirator from a hollow reed he kept in his pocket just for such occasions. "Been delivering calves since before you were born, son," Eli said without looking up as footsteps approached. "This little fella just needs some coaxing is all." Jim Garrett, the neighboring rancher half Eli's age, stood watching with a mixture of concern and respect. "Got your message. Thought you might need a hand." Eli just nodded, focused on the calf. For several long minutes they waited in silence, broken only by the mother's anxious lowing. Then the calf gave a sudden twitch, followed by a weak cough. Moments later, it was breathing on its own. "There we go," Eli said, satisfaction warming his voice as he helped the wobbly calf to its feet. The little bull stood shakily, then found its mother's teat. "Ain't nothing beats seeing that." "Don't know how you do it, Mercer," Jim said, shaking his head. "That's the third one this season would have been lost if not for you." Eli wiped his hands on a rag. "Just takes knowing when to step in and when to step back." He nodded toward the small herd in the distance. "Your cattle seem skittish this morning." Jim frowned. "Yours too. Thought it was just mine. Been that way a couple days now." "Ain't coyotes," Eli said with certainty. "They know better'n to come around here." As the sun finally crested the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the land, Eli surveyed his small ranch. Just 40 acres, but it was his, bought and paid for after decades working other men's cattle. The satisfaction of ownership never got old. "Obliged for coming by, but I reckon we got it from here," he said, gathering his tools. Jim nodded, understanding the dismissal. "You need anything, you holler." Walking back to his cabin, Eli's mind turned to the strange tire tracks he'd noticed yesterday along the rarely used back road that skirted his property. "So nothing to fuss about likely, but worth keeping an eye on. City folks sometimes got lost out here where GPS signals went funny." The cabin stood as it had for nearly a century, built of local pine and riverstone. It wasn't much, 2 rooms with a lean-to addition he'd built for storage, but it was solid and warm, a testament to the craftsmanship of men long gone. Eli had added his own touches: the hand-built porch swing, the carefully stacked wood pile, the vegetable garden now winding down for winter. Inside, everything had its place. Jars of home-canned vegetables lined the shelves beside the small kitchen. Tools hung on pegs by the door, ready for whatever needed fixing. The radio on the counter was tuned to the weather station, and a pot of coffee sat ready on the stove. Eli washed up and settled at the simple wooden table with a plate of eggs from his own hens. As he ate, his eyes drifted to the small collection of photos on the shelf. One showed a much younger Eli in uniform, standing tall beside three other men in desert fatigues. The frame was dusty. He didn't take it down much anymore. 30 years since his service, and sometimes it felt like yesterday. Other times, like a different life entirely. That was before the 40 years of ranch work across 3 states, before the marriage that hadn't lasted, before he'd finally saved enough to buy this place 5 years back. She couldn't abide the loneliness, he murmured to himself, a thought that surfaced whenever he looked at that photo. His ex-wife had tried, but some folks weren't built for the quiet life. Eli was. The simplicity of it suited him, knowing exactly what needed doing each day and doing it well. The radio crackled with the morning forecast. Early cold front moving in from the northwest. Expect temperatures to drop into the mid-20s overnight with the first hard freeze of the season. Eli nodded to himself. Winter preparations couldn't wait much longer. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Mercer," he answered. "Just checking you're still alive, you old hermit," came Jacob White's gruff voice. They'd worked the Peterson spread together 20 years back, before a disagreement Eli barely remembered had put distance between them. "Still kicking," Eli replied. "You need something?" "Man can't call an old friend without needing something. Most men, maybe. You, I ain't so sure." Jacob chuckled. "Town's having that fall festival next weekend. Thought you might show your face for once. Got fence to mend and hay to stack before that cold front hits. Always something needs doing, ain't there?" That's the truth of it. After hanging up, Eli studied his mental list for the day. The north pasture fence had been sagging. Best to tackle that before the weather turned. He gathered his tools, filled a thermos with coffee, and packed a simple lunch. As an afterthought, he strapped on the worn leather holster containing his service revolver. "Never needed it," he muttered to himself, but today felt different somehow. Outside, he paused to study the sky. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, still distant but moving in. Plenty of time to get the fence work done if he moved efficiently. The day passed in the rhythm of physical labor, digging post holes, stretching wire, driving staples. By late afternoon, Eli's muscles ached with the good tired feeling of work well done. The fence was solid again, ready to stand against winter storms. Heading back, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across a rarely used fire road that bordered his property, same as yesterday, but more of them now. Something about their deliberate pattern troubled him. The sky had darkened considerably, the approaching storm painting the landscape in muted grays and purples. The wind had picked up too, carrying the promise of rain and the first real cold of the season. As Eli approached his cabin, his dog Rex came bounding around the corner, ears up and alert. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked, noting the animal's unusual intensity. Rex wasn't a barker, one reason Eli had kept him from the litter. The dog circled, then trotted purposefully toward the storage shed, looking back as if expecting Eli to follow. That's when Eli heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not settling timber, not any of the natural creaks and groans of rural living. It was too faint to identify, but it raised the hair on the back of his neck. Setting down his tools, Eli approached the shed cautiously. Rex stayed at his heels, a low growl building in his throat. The padlock on the door hung open, though Eli was certain he'd secured it that morning. He retrieved the lantern kept by the back door and returned to the shed. The revolver was a reassuring weight against his hip as he considered his options. He could call Sheriff Miller, but the department was understaffed, and the nearest deputy was a good 30 minutes away. By then, whatever, or whoever, had broken into his shed would likely be gone. Never been one to call for help before looking into things myself, he thought, drawing the revolver. Holding the lantern high in his left hand, weapon ready in his right, he approached the shed door, 62 years old and still walking toward trouble instead of away from it. Some folks never learn. With deliberate care, Eli pulled the door open, the hinges protesting softly. The lantern light cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar interior. Tools hanging on the wall, bags of feed stacked in the corner, the old tractor parts he kept meaning to sell. Then he saw it, a slight movement beneath the tarp he used to cover his generator during the winter months. Someone was underneath. "Come on out," he said firmly. "I'm armed, and I ain't in the habit of asking twice." The tarp shifted, and a woman's face appeared, eyes wide with terror. Her dark hair was matted with blood, her face bruised, and her breathing came in ragged gasps. "I can't breathe," she whispered hoarsely, struggling with the heavy tarp wrapped too tightly around her. Eli holstered his weapon immediately and moved forward, helping to free her from the constricting cover. She flinched at his approach, but was too weak to resist as he carefully unwrapped the tarp. In the lantern light, he could see she was in her 30s perhaps, her clothes torn and dirty, with defensive wounds on her arms and a deep cut above her right eye. "I don't know who you are or what you're running from, ma'am," Eli said quietly as she took her first full breath. "But you're safe now." Her eyes, dark and desperate, locked onto his. "No one is safe," she whispered. Whatever trouble this woman was in had just become his trouble too. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke as Eli helped the woman across his yard. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating her battered face, and the fear etched into every line of it. She leaned heavily against him, her steps unsteady. "Almost there," Eli said, adjusting his grip to better support her weight. Rex circled them anxiously, hackles raised, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. Inside the cabin, Eli eased her into his worn armchair by the wood stove. The woman, who had reluctantly given her name as Maria, trembled violently. Whether from cold, pain, or fear, he couldn't tell. Probably all three. Eli stoked the fire and set a kettle to boil before retrieving his first aid kit from beneath the sink. It was better stocked than most, a habit from his years of handling ranch emergencies miles from proper medical care. "I ain't asking what you're running from just yet," he said, dampening a clean cloth. "First things first, let's get you warm and those cuts tended to." She flinched when he approached, but allowed him to clean the gash above her eye. Her breath hissed through clenched teeth as the antiseptic touched raw flesh. "Military?" she asked suddenly, her eyes flicking to the framed photo on the shelf. "Long time back," Eli answered, focused on his work. "Desert Storm." "Medic?" "No, but you patch up enough buddies in the field, you learn a thing or two." Working methodically, Eli cleaned and dressed her visible wounds. His movements were efficient but gentle, maintaining a respectful distance when possible. He'd seen enough in his life to recognize the signs of severe trauma, both physical and otherwise. "That symbol on your wrist," he said quietly, nodding toward a strange geometric design partially visible beneath her torn sleeve. That means something? Maria quickly covered it with her hand. Nothing good. As Eli handed her a mug of hot tea, headlights swept across the front window. Maria's cup clattered to the floor as she bolted upright, eyes wild with panic. "They found me," she whispered hoarsely. Eli moved to the window, staying to the side as he peered out. A black SUV had stopped at the turn in his driveway, its high beams illuminating the approach to his cabin. "There's a root cellar under the kitchen," he said, already moving toward it. "Trapdoors under that rug." She hesitated, clearly torn between fear of capture and fear of trusting a stranger. "Ma'am, I've lived long enough to know when someone's telling the truth about being scared," Eli said simply. "That's good enough for now." Maria nodded once and disappeared down the narrow stairs. Eli replaced the rug, kicked the broken teacup under the stove, and grabbed his shotgun from the rack. Rex he commanded to stay hidden in the bedroom. And the vehicle approached slowly, its tires crunching over gravel. It stopped about 30 yards from the cabin, and Eli counted 3 men emerging into the rain. They wore dark clothing that wasn't quite uniforms, but too coordinated to be civilian. Their movements were disciplined, practiced, military or law enforcement training, Eli guessed. The storm had intensified, rain drumming against the roof as thunder rolled across the hills. Eli stood in shadow, watching as the men surveyed his property with tactical flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness with unnatural precision. One stayed with the vehicle, while the other 2 approached the cabin. Unlike typical visitors who might hurry through the downpour, these men moved with deliberate care, one slightly flanking the other. The contrast between their urban professionalism and his rural simplicity couldn't have been starker. Eli stepped onto the porch as they reached the bottom step, shotgun visible but pointed at the ground. Not threatening, but not hidden either. "Evening," he said, voice carrying over the rain. The men stopped, momentarily surprised to find him waiting. The taller one recovered quickly, offering a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Sorry to bother you so late, sir," he said, showing an ID too briefly for Eli to read. "We're with the Department of Public Safety, looking for a fugitive who might have passed through this area." Eli nodded, expression neutral. "Been here all day fixing fences. Haven't seen a soul except my dog." "Female suspect," the second man said, studying Eli's face. "Dangerous. Escaped custody this morning." "What'd she do?" Eli asked. A pause. "Financial crimes. Embezzlement." The lie hung in the air between them. No one sent armed men in the middle of a storm to find an embezzler. "Mind if we take a look around your property?" the first man asked, gesturing toward the barn and outbuildings. "Just to be thorough." Eli shifted slightly, blocking the doorway more completely. "Actually, I do mind. My daddy taught me 2 things. Respect the law and know your rights. You boys come back with a warrant. I'll cooperate fully." The friendly veneer slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "We could have one here within the hour." "Then I'll see you in an hour," Eli replied evenly. "Meantime, this is private property." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, the taller one nodded. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Mercer." The fact that they knew his name without him providing it wasn't lost on Eli. "You folks drive safe now," he said, not moving from his position until they returned to their vehicle. He watched as they backed down the drive, noting how they didn't immediately leave, but parked just beyond his property line, where the access road met the county highway. Their headlights went dark, but the vehicle remained, waiting. Only when he was certain they couldn't see into the windows did Eli return to the kitchen and remove the rug. "They're gone for now," he called softly, "but they haven't left the area." Maria emerged from the cellar, her face ashen. The brief respite hadn't restored her strength. If anything, the hiding had depleted her last reserves. She collapsed into the chair, her legs giving out entirely. "Department of Public Safety," she said with bitter laugh. "They're not government. They're private security for the syndicate." Outside, the storm had reached its full fury, rain lashing against the windows while thunder shook the cabin's timbers. It matched the intensity brewing inside as Maria finally began to share her story. She'd been an accountant, she explained, hired by what she thought was a legitimate investment firm. Gradually, she'd discovered discrepancies in the accounts, patterns that pointed to money laundering on a massive scale. When she'd dug deeper, she'd found evidence linking the firm to human trafficking operations across 3 states. "They bring people in through remote border crossings," she said, her voice hollow. "Promise them jobs, then take their documents and force them into labor or worse. The money flows through shell companies, then gets invested in legitimate businesses, politicians, judges, even some law enforcement. They're all on the payroll." "And you have proof," Eli said. It wasn't a question. Maria nodded, touching her side where Eli now noticed a slight bulge beneath her torn jacket, a hidden pouch or pocket. Names, dates, account numbers, enough to bring down their entire operation. Her eyes met his. "That's why they'll never stop looking." "I'm not just a witness. I'm a threat to powerful people." "Sheriff Rollins?" Eli asked, thinking of the county lawman he'd known for 30 years. Maria shrugged. "I don't know every name, but I wouldn't trust anyone with a badge until we know for sure." The weight of the situation settled over Eli like a physical burden. At 62, he'd spent decades minding his own business, staying out of trouble, building this small sanctuary for his final years. Now, in the space of an hour, everything had changed. He moved to the window, checking again on the SUV still parked on the road. They were watching, waiting for backup or a warrant, real or manufactured. Either way, time was limited. "They'll kill anyone who helps me," Maria said quietly. "You should drive me to the highway and forget you ever saw me." Eli considered this, weighing options and consequences with the deliberate care of a man who'd seen enough of life to know how quickly it could turn. He thought about times he'd looked away from others' troubles, not from cowardice, but from a belief that some problems weren't his to solve. But this was different. This had come to his door. "My daddy had a saying," Eli finally replied, moving away from the window. "There comes a time when a man's got to decide what he stands for. Guess this is mine." "Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" Maria asked, genuine bewilderment in her voice. Eli began gathering supplies, food, water, first aid items, ammunition, methodically preparing for what might come. "Because some things are just plain wrong," he said simply. "And looking the other way when you know that, well, that makes you part of it." Together, they developed a plan. The cabin wasn't defensible against the kind of force these people could bring. They needed to move, to find somewhere safer where Maria's evidence could reach the right authorities. Eli knew the mountains better than any outsider ever could. There were trails only locals used, places vehicles couldn't follow. As Maria rested, gathering strength for what lay ahead, Eli made final preparations. He'd lived simply, quietly, for so long that this sudden plunge into danger felt almost surreal. Yet underneath the strangeness was a clarity he hadn't felt in years, the absolute certainty of doing what needed to be done. By midnight, the storm had begun to ease, though rain still fell steadily. The SUV remained on the road, a dark sentinel marking the boundary of his property. More would come, Eli was certain. People with that much power and that much to lose wouldn't give up easily. "Been minding my own business for 62 years, he murmured, checking the loads in his revolver. "Reckon that streak ends tonight." They worked through the remaining darkness, preparing for what was coming. Eli moved with purpose, decades of military and ranch experience guiding his hands as he transformed his simple cabin into something more defensible. "Military taught me to use whatever's at hand," he explained, rigging fishing line across likely approach paths, connecting it to hanging pots and pans. "Might not stop them, but we'll hear them coming." Maria worked alongside him, despite her injuries, her movements gaining steadiness as she found purpose in the preparations. She stacked furniture against the windows, leaving just enough space to see through without being easily spotted. Eli found himself recalling desert training exercises, ambush tactics, defensive positions, memories he hadn't accessed in years, suddenly sharp and clear. The muscle memory returned too, his hands automatically checking sight lines and escape routes. "These men," he asked, testing the tripwire system, "what kind of training do they have?" "Ex-military mostly," Maria replied. "Some former law enforcement. The syndicate pays well for loyalty and skill." A brief shadow of doubt crossed Eli's face as he considered the odds. 2 against unknown numbers, with superior weapons and training. But the moment passed quickly. Impossible odds just meant you needed a better plan. Rex had been growing increasingly agitated, pacing between windows and doors, occasionally stopping to stare fixedly toward the mountains behind the cabin. Even the livestock seemed affected. Eli could hear his small herd of cattle lowing nervously in the distance, clustered together rather than spread across the pasture. "Something's got the animals spooked worse than us," Eli observed. The storm that had briefly eased returned with renewed fury. Wind howled through the eaves as rain lashed against the windows. The lights flickered once, twice, then failed completely, plunging the cabin into darkness until Eli lit the kerosene lamps he kept ready for such occasions. "Could be a blessing," he said, adjusting the lamp's flame. "Harder for them to approach in this weather, and the dark works both ways." As if answering his words, a flash of lightning illuminated the yard, and a large shape moving along the tree line. Both froze, but when the next lightning flash came, the shape was gone. "Mountain lion," Eli said with quiet amazement. "That cat shouldn't be this close to the buildings. Haven't seen one near the cabin in years." Maria glanced nervously toward the window. "Is that normal?" "Nothing about tonight is normal," Eli replied. By midnight, they had done all they could. The cabin was as secure as they could make it, though Eli harbored no illusions about their chances if a full assault came. They took shifts watching, one sleeping while the other kept vigil. During his watch, Eli cleaned his old service revolver, the familiar ritual calming his mind. The weight of it was reassuring in his weathered hands. 20 years since I fired this in anger," he murmured, mostly to himself. "Hoped I never would again." Pre-dawn brought the attack they'd been expecting. Eli, who had been dozing in the chair while Maria watched, was instantly alert at the first faint jingle of their makeshift alarm system. "2 of them," he whispered, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. "Coming from the east side." The men moved with professional precision, using the remaining darkness and the cover of trees to approach. They would have succeeded in reaching the cabin undetected if not for Eli's improvised warning system. What happened next occurred so quickly that later Eli would struggle to recall the exact sequence. As the first man reached the edge of the clearing, a tawny blur launched from the shadows. The mountain lion, somehow still in the area, attacking with explosive force. The man's scream shattered the night as he fell beneath the big cat's weight. His partner turned, momentarily distracted by the attack, giving Eli the opening he needed. Eli burst through the side door, revolver raised. "Drop it!" he commanded as the second man swung back toward him, weapon half raised. The man hesitated just long enough for Eli to close the distance. Not trusting his shooting accuracy in the dim light, Eli relied instead on decades of hard physical work. He tackled the intruder with surprising strength for his age, driving him to the ground. They struggled briefly, but Eli's knowledge of leverage overcame the man's younger strength. "Stay down, son," Eli growled, pressing the revolver against the man's temple. "I don't want to kill you, but I will." The mountain lion had already disappeared into the darkness, leaving the first attacker bleeding and unconscious but alive. The momentary advantage had been enough. Minutes later, both men were securely bound with baling wire, their weapons and equipment confiscated. But victory had come at a price. During the struggle, the second man had managed to slash Eli's shoulder with a knife, opening a deep wound that now bled freely. Back inside the cabin, Maria examined the injury with unexpected expertise. "Worked in emergency room before they took me," she explained, cleaning the wound with steady hands. "Hold still." The cut was deep, but had missed anything vital. As Maria stitched the wound closed with supplies from Eli's first aid kit, they assessed their situation. "They dropped this," Maria said, holding up a satellite phone she'd recovered from one of the attackers. As she activated it, her face paled. "They have our photos, coordinates. They know exactly where we are." Eli winced as she tied off the last stitch. "And there'll be more coming." "A lot more," Maria confirmed grimly. This was just the advance team. Pain radiated from Eli's shoulder down his arm, a constant burning reminder of his vulnerability. At 62, he wasn't bouncing back from injury like he once had. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through his upper body. The cabin that had felt like a potential fortress hours earlier now seemed terribly exposed. They had perhaps a few hours before reinforcements arrived, professionals who would come better prepared and in greater numbers. "We can't stay here," Eli said finally, forcing himself to his feet despite the pain. "Cabin's too easy to surround." "Where can we go?" Maria asked. Eli moved to the window, looking toward the mountains rising behind his property. His mountains. He'd hiked every ridge and valley for 40 years. "These mountains raised me," he said slowly. "There's places up there vehicles can't go, and men don't know about, paths that ain't on any map." They packed with urgent efficiency, taking only what was essential for survival: food, water, first aid supplies, ammunition. Eli fought through the pain as he gathered what they needed, refusing to acknowledge the way his vision occasionally blurred at the edges. "Just water, food, matches, and medicine," he instructed. "Take only what keeps you alive. Everything else is just weight." As they prepared to leave, Eli paused at his bedroom doorway, eyes falling on the framed photo of himself in uniform. After a moment's hesitation, he slipped it from the frame and tucked it into his shirt pocket, a small token of who he had been, who he still was at his core. The rain had finally stopped, though heavy clouds still threatened. Dawn was breaking as they slipped out the back of the cabin toward the forest edge where the mountains began their steep ascent. Rex trotted ahead, naturally assuming the role of scout. "You scared?" Eli asked, noticing Maria's trembling hands as they paused at the tree line. "Yes," she admitted without shame. "Good," he replied. "Fear keeps a man alert." It's panic that kills. As they began their ascent up the hidden trail, Maria studied Eli with new understanding. "You're leaving everything behind," she said softly. "Your home, your land." Eli didn't look back at the cabin that represented his life's work, the culmination of decades of saving and planning, the place where he'd expected to live out his remaining years in peace. 30 years I worked to buy this place, he said, voice rough with emotion he wouldn't fully express. Funny how quick a man can walk away when something matters more. They climbed steadily for 20 minutes before reaching a ridge that offered a view back toward the property. From this vantage point, they could see 3 black SUVs approaching the cabin from different directions, coordinating their movements with military precision. "Just in time," Maria whispered. Eli adjusted his pack, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. The path ahead would be challenging even for someone uninjured, but he knew these mountains in a way the pursuers never could. Every game trail, every seasonal creek, every cave and outcropping, this was his territory. "These mountains raised me," he repeated, this time with quiet confidence. "Now they might just save us both." For 2 days they moved through the mountains like ghosts. Eli led them along game trails and forgotten logging paths, choosing routes that maximized cover while minimizing the physical toll on his wounded shoulder. The terrain was unforgiving. Steep slopes covered in loose shale, dense thickets of pine and scrub oak, ravines that had to be carefully navigated. "How much farther?" Maria asked as they paused to rest at midday, her voice betraying fatigue but not complaint. "Another few hours," Eli replied, studying the ridgeline ahead. "Need to keep to higher ground where we can see what's coming." Despite his own exhaustion and the throbbing pain in his shoulder, Eli maintained a steady pace. Rex ranged ahead, occasionally returning to ensure they followed. The dog had taken to Maria with surprising quickness, sometimes staying close to her when the footing grew treacherous. "Stay downwind," Eli cautioned as they skirted a meadow where he'd spotted movement. "Boar can't see worth a damn, but their smell is better than any dog." As if summoned by his words, a massive wild boar erupted from the underbrush 30 yards ahead, its tusks gleaming wickedly in the dappled sunlight. Instead of fleeing, it charged directly toward them, covering ground with alarming speed. "Don't run," Eli commanded, pushing Maria behind him. "Stand your ground." The boar, easily 300 pounds of muscle and fury, closed the distance in seconds. At the last possible moment, Eli stepped sideways while throwing his jacket wide, confusing the animal's charge. The boar's momentum carried it past them, giving Eli just enough time to draw his revolver. But before he could fire, the boar wheeled for another charge. This time, it caught Eli as he tried to maneuver Maria to safety. The impact sent him sprawling, reopening his shoulder wound as he hit the rocky ground. The animal pivoted for a killing thrust with its tusks. In that moment, Eli's decades in the wilderness saved them both. Rolling despite the pain, he grabbed a fallen branch and jammed it crosswise into the boar's mouth as it charged again. The animal's own momentum drove the improvised barrier into the soft earth, temporarily pinning it. "Move back!" Eli shouted to Maria as he scrambled away, drawing his revolver and firing a single shot that dropped the enraged animal. The report echoed across the valley, a sound that could carry for miles in the clear mountain air. "We need to move," Eli said grimly, pressing his hand against his bleeding shoulder. "That shot's like ringing a dinner bell." They pushed on, Eli's breathing growing labored as blood seeped through his makeshift bandage. During rest periods, Maria shared more of her story, how she'd been forced to work for the syndicate after discovering their operations, how they'd kept her compliant by threatening her sister's family. I played along, she explained, documented everything I could, waited for a chance to escape with enough evidence to bring them down. Eli nodded, understanding the patience such a plan required. In turn, he shared knowledge acquired through a lifetime in these mountains, which plants were edible, how to read weather from cloud patterns, signs that indicated water nearby. By late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered once more, and Eli's strength was flagging. The blood loss and constant movement had taken their toll, and even his considerable endurance had limits. "There's a cabin about 2 miles north," he said finally, gesturing toward a distant ridge. "Belongs to Jacob White." "Friend of yours?" Maria asked. Eli's expression tightened. "Used to be. Haven't spoken in 15 years, but he's still the finest man I know. What happened between you?" "Disagreement over a property line. Foolish thing. The kind that seems important until something like this comes along." He adjusted his pack, wincing. "Doubt he'll be happy to see me, but he won't turn away someone in need." The rain began as they approached the ridge where Jacob's cabin stood, a more substantial structure than Eli's, built to withstand the harsher weather of the higher elevation. Smoke curled from the chimney, confirming someone was in residence. "Let me go first," Eli said, as they approached cautiously. Jacob's not the kind to shoot before asking questions, but 15 years is a long time. The cabin's door opened before they reached it. A tall, lean figure stood silhouetted against the warm light from inside, shotgun held casually, but ready. "That's far enough," called a gravelly voice. "State your business." "It's Eli Mercer, Jacob," Eli called back, stepping into the circle of light spilling from the cabin. "I've got trouble on my heels and nowhere else to go." There was a long pause as Jacob took in the sight of them. Eli bloodied and exhausted. Maria battered but standing tall, Rex alert at their side. 15 years, and you show up looking like something the cat dragged in," Jacob finally said, lowering his shotgun. His weathered face, now framed by a white beard, revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Wouldn't be here if I had any other choice," Eli replied simply. Another beat of silence stretched between them, decades of friendship and years of estrangement hanging in the balance. Then Jacob stepped aside, gesturing them in with a jerk of his head. "Well, don't just stand there bleeding on my porch. Get inside before you attract every predator in the county." The cabin's interior was warm and surprisingly well kept for a man living alone. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its crackling flames casting dancing shadows across the room. Simple, sturdy furniture, handcrafted from local timber, spoke of Jacob's skill as a woodworker. "Sit," Jacob commanded, pointing Eli toward a chair by the fire. "Let me look at that shoulder." As Jacob cleaned and redressed Eli's wound with practiced hands, the two men cautiously circled the history between them. "That property line dispute seems pretty damn foolish now," Jacob remarked, applying fresh bandages. "Always was," Eli admitted. "Pride's an expensive thing to maintain." "Took you long enough to figure that out," Jacob said, but there was no real heat in his words. Once Eli's wound was tended, and Maria had been given dry clothes and hot food. They explained their situation. Jacob listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Been hearing strange radio chatter," he said when they'd finished. "Thought it was just the weather making the frequencies jump, but it was coded communications." He brought out an old military band radio, tuning it carefully until fragments of transmission became audible. Maria listened intently, then nodded. "That's them. Same codes they used in their secure communications. They're coordinating search patterns. And getting more sophisticated about it," Jacob added. "They've brought in tracking dogs, thermal imaging." Been watching helicopter sweeps over the lower valleys since yesterday. They're using every resource they have, Maria said quietly. They can't afford to let this evidence reach the authorities. The three of them studied a topographical map spread across Jacob's table, marking known search areas and plotting potential routes to safety. My nephew Andy's a state trooper over in Crawford County, Jacob said, tapping a location on the map. Good boy, straight as they come. If anyone can be trusted to handle this right, it's him. How do we reach him? Eli asked. That's the tricky part, Jacob replied. They're monitoring all the regular frequencies, and with this storm, cell service is spotty at best. After hours of discussion, they developed a plan. Jacob would create a diversion to draw attention away from the mountains, allowing Eli and Maria to travel by a different route toward Crawford County, where Jacob's nephew could meet them. It's risky, Jacob acknowledged. But sitting here waiting to be found isn't an option. As Maria rested, the two old friends spoke quietly by the fire, mending the breach years of silence had created. Should have reached out long ago, Eli said. Wasted too many years over nothing. Jacob nodded, poking at the embers. Stubborn old fools, both of us. At our age, you'd think we'd know better. Some lessons take longer to learn than others. In the morning, they made final preparations. Jacob provided fresh supplies, ammunition, and most importantly, detailed information about patrol movements he'd gleaned from the radio transmissions. They think they're hunting you, Jacob said, as they prepared to part ways. Truth is, you're leading them right where they don't want to go. The moment of farewell was brief, but weighted with emotion. These were men who had never found words easy, but understood the value of actions. You always were too stubborn to die, Eli Mercer, Jacob said, clasping his friend's hand firmly. Takes one to know one, old friend, Eli replied, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. As Eli and Maria prepared to depart through the back country, Jacob offered one last piece of wisdom. Remember what I always used to say, age ain't nothing but wisdom with aches attached, and we got wisdom enough for this fight. Eli nodded, understanding the truth of it. What they lacked in youth and strength, they made up for in experience and determination. Sometimes, Jacob said quietly as they disappeared into the trees, the only way to win is to change the game they're playing. By the second day after leaving Jacob's cabin, the weather turned against them. Snow began to fall as they climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature dropping with each passing hour. The wind cut through their clothing, finding every gap and seam. Eli pushed forward despite the growing pain in his shoulder, his face set in lines of grim determination. Maria matched his pace, her strength and resilience surprising given her ordeal. They spoke little, conserving energy, but the shared struggle forged a bond between them stronger than words could express. During brief rest periods, they exchanged fragments of their lives. Maria spoke of her childhood in a small border town, her struggle to put herself through college, her pride in becoming an accountant. Never thought honesty would cost so much, she said, watching the snow swirl around them. Eli nodded, understanding the price of principles. My father hunted these ridges, he offered in return. His father before him. Mountain has a memory for those who respect it. As they traveled, both noticed the unusual behavior of wildlife around them. A pack of wolves shadowed their progress, keeping a consistent distance, close enough to observe but making no move to attack. Wolves don't act like this naturally, Eli remarked, watching the animals through his binoculars. They're avoiding us like we're poisonous. Maybe they sense something we don't, Maria suggested. The howling of distant helicopters forced them to alter their route several times, taking shelter under dense tree canopies until the sound faded. More concerning was the radio silence from Jacob. They'd expected periodic updates through the emergency radio he'd provided, but heard nothing since their departure. By midday, they approached the coordinates where Jacob's nephew was supposed to meet them, a natural clearing beside a stream crossing where vehicles could access the mountain trail. Eli's unease grew as they neared the location. Something felt wrong. Rex sensed it too. The dog's hackles raised as they approached the final ridge overlooking the meeting point, a low growl building in his throat. "Something ain't right up ahead," Eli whispered, motioning for Maria to stay low. Andy should have left a sign by now. Cautiously, they crept forward until they could observe the clearing below. What they saw confirmed Eli's worst fears. Jacob lay slumped against a tree, his face bloodied but conscious. Two men in tactical gear stood guard nearby, weapons ready. Of Andy, there was no sign. "Stay here," Eli instructed Maria, passing her the radio and his pack. "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, follow the ridge east. There's another trail down to the highway." Before she could protest, he was moving, circling wide to approach from the far side of the clearing. Using every scrap of woodcraft he possessed, Eli managed to neutralize one guard with a rock to the head before reaching Jacob. "Knew you'd come," Jacob mumbled through swollen lips. "Shouldn't have." "Where's Andy?" Eli asked, checking his friend's injuries while keeping watch for the second guard. "They got to him through his little girl," Jacob explained, wincing as Eli probed a particularly nasty wound. "Showed him pictures of her at school. What choice did he have?" The missing guard's radio crackled to life, and Eli knew their time was short. He helped Jacob to his feet, supporting his weight as they moved as quickly as possible back toward Maria's position. They barely made it to cover before additional vehicles arrived in the clearing, disgorging more men with the same professional bearing as their previous pursuers. Maria gasped when she saw Jacob's condition. Without a word, she began cleaning his wounds with supplies from their limited medical kit, her hands gentle but efficient. "I'm sorry," Jacob said, his eyes finding Eli's. "Andy gave them everything, our plan, your likely route. They've got people positioned all along the way to Crawford County." Eli absorbed this news with outward calm, though inside a cold fury was building. Not at Andy, no man could be blamed for protecting his child, but at the people who would use a little girl as leverage. "Route's compromised," he said simply. "We'll need a new plan." They retreated to a sheltered ravine where they could talk without fear of immediate discovery. Jacob's injuries, while painful, weren't life-threatening. Still, he was in no condition to travel far. "The evidence Maria carries is your only hope now," Jacob said. "You need to get it to federal authorities, not local, not state. Too many pockets already bought." He described an alternate route, longer and more dangerous, but less likely to be watched. It would take them through the most remote sections of the mountains before bringing them out near the interstate where federal offices were located. "I can't leave you here like this, Jacob," Eli protested. Jacob shook his head. "Some debts you can't repay. Some you shouldn't try. This ain't about us anymore." The two men locked eyes, decades of history passing between them in a silent moment of understanding. "You finish this thing, Eli," Jacob said finally. "Make it mean something." With reluctance born of necessity, they left Jacob in a well-concealed cave with enough supplies to last several days. The promise to return hung unspoken between them, both men knowing it might be impossible to keep. The new route took them higher into the mountains, along narrow ridgelines where a single misstep meant disaster. Snow was falling more heavily now, limiting visibility and making the footing treacherous. By late afternoon, they were traversing a particularly exposed section of trail when Eli heard it. the faint but unmistakable sound of pursuit. "They've found our trail," he said grimly. They pushed forward with renewed urgency, fighting exhaustion and the increasingly hostile elements. The light was fading fast as they entered a narrow pass between towering rock faces, a natural bottleneck they couldn't avoid. Halfway through the pass, Rex froze, ears flat against his head. A moment later, Eli spotted them. Dark figures positioned at both ends of the pass, effectively cutting off escape. "Nowhere to run!" a voice called out, amplified in the narrow space. "It's over." 4 men advanced from each direction, moving with the coordination of professional operators. Their weapons were raised, but not yet aimed to fire. They wanted Maria alive. "The woman comes with us," the lead pursuer announced. "You might walk away, old man." Eli positioned himself between Maria and the approaching men, his revolver drawn, but knowing it would be little use against their superior numbers and equipment. "Not how I was raised," he replied steadily. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As the men closed in, a familiar tawny shape launched from an overhead ledge. The mountain lion, somehow having followed them all this way, its massive body crashed into the lead pursuer, causing chaos in the narrow confines of the pass. In the momentary confusion, Eli pushed Maria toward a narrow side crevice. "Go," he shouted. "I'll hold them." The brief firefight that followed was chaotic and desperate. Eli managed to drop 2 pursuers before taking a bullet to his leg. As he fell, Maria, who had not fled as instructed, dragged him toward the crevice. Together they squeezed through the narrow opening, emerging onto a precarious ledge above a steep ravine. With no time to consider alternatives, they began a treacherous descent in near darkness, pursued by shouts and gunfire from above. The mountain lion had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but its intervention had given them the precious moments needed to escape the immediate trap. Hours later, they found shelter in a natural cave as night fell completely. The temperature had plummeted, and snow was now falling in earnest, obscuring their tracks, but also making travel impossible. Inside the cave, Maria examined Eli's wounds by the light of a small emergency fire. The bullet had passed through his thigh, missing the bone, but causing significant blood loss. Combined with his previous shoulder injury and the physical toll of their journey, Eli's condition was deteriorating rapidly. "Stay with me, Eli," Maria urged as she worked to stem the bleeding. "Don't you dare give up now." He tried to focus on her face, but his vision kept blurring at the edges. The cold seemed to have seeped into his very bones, and no amount of effort could stop the shivering that racked his body. "Sometimes a man's best ain't enough," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. "But it's all I got to give." As consciousness began to slip away, Eli found himself doing something he hadn't done in decades, praying. Not formal words or remembered phrases, but a simple, desperate plea from the heart. "First time in my life I'm praying for a miracle," he whispered into the darkness. "Ain't too proud to admit it." Through the night, Maria fought to keep Eli alive. The small fire provided minimal warmth, and their supplies were dangerously depleted. By dawn, his breathing had grown shallow, his skin ashen. "You didn't give up on me," she whispered. "I'm not giving up on you." The blizzard had eased, though snow still fell. Maria made her decision. Taking the radio, emergency supplies, and Eli's revolver, she left Rex to guard him while she ventured out to find help, knowing she might never find her way back. For hours, she struggled through knee-deep snow, fighting exhaustion and despair. Several times, she nearly turned back, but the thought of Eli dying alone drove her forward. It was late afternoon when Maria stumbled upon an elderly Native American man gathering plants beneath a rocky overhang. Their mutual surprise nearly ended in disaster. The old man reached for something at his belt, while Maria instinctively raised Eli's revolver. But before either could act, the ground beneath the elder's feet gave way. Maria dropped the weapon and lunged forward, catching his arm just before he fell into a rocky crevasse. "Thank you," he said simply, after she pulled him to safety. "My friend is dying," Maria replied without preamble. "Please help us." The elder studied her face for a long moment. "The mountain brought us together. This is not accident." The man introduced himself as Thomas Running Bear. When Maria described their situation, he nodded gravely. "Some men the earth itself chooses to protect," he said. "I have seen this one in my dreams." Thomas led her back to the cave with surprising speed. Upon seeing Eli's condition, he wasted no time. With quiet efficiency, he examined the wounds, then opened a leather pouch containing various roots and herbs. "We must move him," he announced. "My cabin not far." They fashioned a travois from branches and blankets, and with Thomas leading the way, transported Eli to a small, well-built cabin tucked into a protected hollow. Inside, warmth from a wood stove enveloped them. Thomas immediately began treating Eli's wounds, combining traditional medicine with modern first aid supplies. He created poultices from the plants he'd been gathering, chanting softly as he worked. "This will draw infection," he explained, applying a pungent mixture to Eli's leg wound. "This for fever." Throughout the night they worked together. Thomas's knowledge of healing plants proved remarkably effective, gradually reducing the fever and inflammation. By the second day, Eli finally regained consciousness. "Thought I was meeting my maker for sure," he murmured. "Not your time," Thomas replied. "Mountain has work for you still." As Eli's strength gradually returned, Thomas shared his knowledge of the mountains and the syndicate's operations. He had been observing their activities for months, gathering information to share with his contact in federal law enforcement. "I never believed in anything I couldn't see," Maria admitted one evening. "Maybe that's changing." "The seen and unseen are not separate," Thomas replied. "Just different ways of knowing." On the fourth day, Agent David Parker of the FBI arrived, having traveled on snowshoes through the back country to avoid detection. Thomas had contacted him using a secure protocol they'd established months earlier. Parker examined the evidence Maria had carried so far at such great cost. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," he confirmed. "Been tracking this organization for 3 years. Your evidence could bring down the entire operation." He explained that a federal investigation had been ongoing, but had repeatedly hit walls due to the syndicate's political connections. Despite his improved condition, Eli remained weak. Yet when plans were made for the final journey to safety, he was adamant. "I've come this far," he said firmly. "Aim to see it through." Thomas offered a secret path known only to his people. Leads through sacred places. No maps show it. "When this is over," Maria asked, "what happens to everyone who helped me?" "That's why we have witness protection," Parker replied. "New names, new lives." The reality of what lay ahead settled over them. Even with the evidence safely delivered, none of their lives would ever be the same. Thomas performed a blessing ceremony the night before their departure, burning sacred herbs, the sweet smoke filling the cabin as he spoke words passed down through generations. Though the ritual was from his tradition, its meaning transcended cultural boundaries, a prayer for protection, for justice, for safe passage. For a brief moment, the weight of their journey lifted. In that small cabin, Surrounded by wilderness and danger, four strangers from vastly different worlds had found common ground in the most fundamental of human values. Four strangers bound by nothing but what's right, Eli observed quietly. Might be enough. Has to be. Dawn broke clear and cold as they set out on the final leg of their journey. Thomas led them along ancient paths invisible to untrained eyes, narrow deer trails, dry creek beds, and passages between rock formations that seemed impassable until you were through them. My grandfather brought me here as a boy, Thomas explained. Said this path would only be used in greatest need. Eli moved with growing strength, his body responding to Thomas's treatments better than expected. Rex stayed close by his side, occasionally ranging ahead to scout. As they traveled, Agent Parker shared more about the investigation. We've suspected judges, police chiefs, even a state senator involved, he explained. 3 years gathering fragments, but we could never connect all the pieces. Your evidence proves it, shows the money flow, the protection payments, the whole corrupt network. How'd they get so powerful without anyone noticing? Maria asked. Started small, gradually bought influence, compromised people one by one. By the time anyone recognized the pattern, they had enough power to silence questions. All my life I kept to myself, Eli remarked during a brief rest. Funny how things turn out. Maria studied him with newfound understanding. When did you know you'd risk everything for this? Never decided, Eli replied after consideration. Just couldn't do otherwise, and still be the man I was raised to be. By midday, they approached the boundary where wilderness gave way to civilization. Beyond the final ridge lay the highway where Parker's colleagues would be waiting. They had nearly reached the rendezvous point when Rex froze, hackles raised. Seconds later, they heard vehicles approaching along the Forest Service road below. Through binoculars, Parker confirmed their fears. Syndicate enforcers, heavily armed. 4 black SUVs had taken strategic positions blocking access to the highway. Men in tactical gear established a perimeter, cutting off their escape. They must have someone inside the bureau, Parker muttered, reaching for his radio. His words were cut short by the sound of a round being chambered behind them. They turned to find themselves surrounded. Quite a journey you've had, said a tall, lean man stepping forward. Unfortunately, it ends here. Eli recognized the voice, the same man who had come to his cabin claiming to be from the Department of Public Safety. You're a stubborn old man who should have minded his own business, the enforcer said. This became my business when you brought it to my door, Eli replied steadily. What happened next occurred with remarkable coordination. Thomas knelt suddenly, pressing his palm to the earth and uttering words in his native tongue. A dense fog began rising from the ground, a natural phenomenon perfectly timed. As visibility deteriorated, Parker seized the opportunity to disarm the nearest operative. Eli tackled another who was reaching for Maria. The enforcer lunged for Eli, pinning him against a tree. You never had a chance, old man. Age ain't nothing but wisdom with aches attached, Eli gasped, and wisdom's what you're lacking, son. With movements honed through decades of hard labor, Eli used the man's momentum against him, twisting just enough to unbalance him on the uneven ground. As the enforcer stumbled, Eli delivered a precise blow, not enough to kill, but sufficient to incapacitate. The fog, combined with the confusion, gave them the crucial advantage. Then came the reassuring wail of federal sirens. Parker's backup burst into view, quickly overwhelming the remaining syndicate forces. The mountain has chosen its champions well, Thomas observed quietly. Within hours, Maria's evidence was safely in federal custody. They watched from a federal building as news reports broke the story. A major criminal syndicate exposed. officials and judges taken into custody, a state senator facing indictment. The senator, 2 judges, and the regional director are all in custody, Parker confirmed. It's over. In the following days, they received updates on the aftermath. Jacob had been found alive. The syndicate's operations were being dismantled, and dozens of trafficking victims had been rescued. Thomas declined the offer of witness protection, choosing to return to his mountains. On the morning he prepared to leave, a familiar tawny shape appeared briefly at the edge of the nearby woods, the mountain lion, somehow having followed them. "One last farewell," Thomas said. "The spirit acknowledges what you have done." 6 months later, Eli pulled his truck up to his ranch. The cabin had been repaired, better than before, thanks to neighbors who had rallied once the full story became known. As he stepped from the truck, he was surprised to see a figure waiting on the porch. Maria, returned from giving testimony. "Is this still home after everything?" she asked, gesturing to the rebuilt cabin. Eli looked around at the place he'd worked his whole life to obtain, now transformed by experiences he'd never sought but couldn't regret. "Home ain't just a place," he said finally. "It's the people who stand by you when standing's hardest."